Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalati wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, welcome back to those who have been watching this series of lectures that are discussing Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's ideas around the traditional religious narrative and the counter narrative that he offers. These lectures took place in Dallas in 2015, and it was the first time that he fully articulated some of these thoughts in sort of a comprehensive way, from A to Z, if you will. The background to it we've discussed in earlier episodes, but essentially was responsive to some of the things that had been going on and were going on and continue to go on in the world, particularly the Muslim world today. The lecture series that I'm presenting is now at a point where we have discussed an introduction to this sort of broader idea around the religious narrative, and then to the main players, the main scholars who have articulated the visions that have come together as part of this narrative. And in that, again, I'm putting forward the views that Javed Ghamidi articulates in these series of lectures he conducted around sort of who these influential individuals, scholars were. That includes four main people. The first is Imam Ghazali. The second is Ibn Taymiyyah. The third is Shah Waliullah. And the fourth is Maulana Maududi. And each of them have distinct visions, religious visions, with regard to the faith itself. But what we concluded on in the last session was the idea that despite the fact that Imam Ghazali has a Sufi vision, that Ibn Taymiyyah has a Salafi vision, that Shah Waliullah unites and converges the Sufi and Salafi visions, that Maulana Maududi puts forward, if you will, a political vision of Islam, that collectively, when it comes to the relationship between religion and the state, they're all on the same page. Essentially all on the same page. That despite all other differences, in a variety of areas, on fiqh, on legal rulings, on a number of things, and despite even being fiercely critical, some of them of each other, like Ibn Taymiyyah of Imam Ghazali, for instance, that despite that, when it comes to religion and the state, their narrative is the same, and that narrative is the traditional, or for Ghamidi Sahib, that is the traditional religious narrative. So, this lecture will begin to delve into what the key points, what the salient points of that narrative are. Right? The principles of their ideas around the state and religion are really the same, but what is it? What's the source of that? How does it come about for them? How are they thinking about these things with regard to religion and state? So in order to understand this relationship with religion and state that they are all in agreement of, we need to touch on some of these other points, background points that inform their ideas of religion and the state, these background points on which they are also on the same page, essentially. The first point in that traditional narrative revolves around the idea of shirk, associating partners with God, kufr, the rejection of truth, and irtidad, apostasy. Their ideas on these concepts of shirk, kufr, apostasy are foundational, and they are in agreement with regard to all of these as being major sins and major crimes. And we're going to talk about the distinction that Ghamidi Sahib makes between the idea of sin and crime and why that's consequential. Shirk is a sin. This idea of associating partners with God, it's a sin. It's one that the Quran, in fact, goes so far in many people's views, and it's a very valid view. It's one that the Quran explicitly seems to say that is a sin that can never be forgiven, that Allah Ta'ala, that God will forgive other sins, but not that one. Ghamidi Sahib points this out. But he says the interesting thing is there is broad agreement with almost everybody that these three things, and let me step back for a minute and explain what apostasy is. Apostasy in its sort of most basic sense is the notion of leaving the faith. And what's deeper within that is the idea that leaving the faith that you believe is true. So it's that leaving the faith, the rejection of that faith that you were in, that is apostasy, for those who don't know. Okay, so these ideas, shirk, associating partners with God, kufr, rejecting the truth, apostasy, leaving the faith. These three things are all major sins, right? Everyone's in agreement there. But the question that comes up is that, are they also crimes? Are they crimes in the present world? Right? As Ghamidi Sahib points out, when you say they're all major sins, part of what you're essentially alluding to is the fact that, yeah, you'll be punished, but by the divine in another life, right? In an afterlife. What about here? Is there punishment for these major sins as major crimes here? And more importantly, is that done through the agency of the state? Can state law punish these major sins? Traditionally, the idea among Muslims, and this part of the narrative, is that these things, this behavior, these major sins, shirk, kufr, apostasy, should be eradicated and finished. That is a goal, that's an objective. And that whatever collective structure governs over the Muslim community, it should be part of their aim to eradicate these practices. As Ghamidi Sahib notes, this is in agreement. That these sins need to be eradicated. There's also agreement among these folks, these major influences and beyond that, that state power can be used to this end. The question really that comes up, or the disagreement, is how precisely that is to be done. In his lecture, Ghamidi Sahib goes through each of these major sins. And so let me explore sort of his ideas there. He starts with a discussion of apostasy. He says, on the issue of shirk and kufr, there are some disagreements. And he's going to get into that. But he says, with regard to apostasy, there is generally this agreement that it is not worth any pardon. That the consequence of apostasy is the death penalty. Again, the issue here is not what God will do to these people who apostate, but the issue is, what will the Muslim collective do about this? If you are born in a Muslim family, Ghamidi Sahib says, and then you do kufr, according to the traditional narrative, the Muslim government then must carry out some kind of punishment. And there's a procedural law as to what must be done, etc. But the principle that they should be punished is in agreement as part of within the traditional narrative. And he says this becomes particularly fascinating when you start delving into the fact that, well, apostasy exists in different ways. And this is understood within the traditional narrative. There is what you might consider an internal apostasy, right? Or maybe internal, not, but it is one where you would say internally that person is explicitly coming out as an apostate. They are confessing, they are admitting, there's an admission of apostasy by the individual. In this scenario, there's not much debate. The person has admitted it. He said that they're doing it. Once that admission has taken place, and similar to sort of a criminal trial, they've confessed, okay, the punishment's there. But then Ghamidi Sahib says it gets more complicated. What I might characterize as the external apostasy, where the individual is actually denying that they have committed apostasy. And the debate becomes that despite this denial, despite the fact that they are not admitting to it, that there's an agreement that no, they are still in the state of being an apostate for X number of reasons. That scenario is also one where there is some disagreement, but that presents, Ghamidi Sahib says, a number of challenges for those who are constructing this traditional narrative. He puts forward the example of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who ends up sort of being the founder and leader of the Qadiani movement or the Ahmadiyya. And Mirza Ghulam Ahmed says we are Muslim. He says they're going to follow the Sharia. But he says we have another prophet. Who's him? And the question becomes, what do you do in that scenario as to whether that person's status is as an apostate? Right? They're not saying that they aren't Muslim. They're not saying that they actually won't follow Islamic law, but they are making an addition. And so the Muslim collective essentially says, no. For all intents and purposes, you are apostates based on this additional claim that you are making, and despite your denial of being an apostate. Why is this important? Partly it's important. We have this extreme example, if you will, or in some respects extreme, right, of the Ahmadiyya. But this starts moving very gingerly in this line between interpretive freedom and heterodoxy. Your ability to have a different interpretation within the faith, and when that interpretation takes you outside of the faith. That's what Ghamidi Saab is setting up to think about right now as a challenge for the traditional narrative. Within the traditional narrative, there is essentially no difference between these two types of apostasy. The one where there's a confession and the one where there is a denial, but the accusation is enough. Right? The accusation of apostasy, based on whatever evidence or proof, is essentially functioning the same as the confession. For the traditional narrative, there's really no difference between these two. The only difference being maybe in some procedural or the distinctions that are made, Ghamidi Saab points out. Both situations, though, for the traditional narrative, in principle, are going to warrant going to the state and the state ending up the court sort of deciding. Here, Ghamidi Saab also goes down the route of discussing this issue of blasphemy. And he takes some time to discuss this, and I think it's worth sort of pointing out and discussing, because it's a fascinating distinction that he's pointing out that sometimes gets lost on folks. He notes that, and has stated in his previous lectures, that there is no notion of criminalizing blasphemy in the Quran or the Sunnah, or even within the viewpoint of the jurists. And initially one takes pause because you're thinking, well, that doesn't seem to make sense, especially from the jurist standpoint. But what he's doing, what Ghamidi Saab is doing, is pointing out this distinction that exists between apostasy and blasphemy. Blasphemy, or expressing some view that is seen to, usually in the context of some kind of insult to the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And apostasy, a rejection, a leaving of the faith. With regard to blasphemy, there's no criminalization. With regard to apostasy, the matter is a little different. So what ends up happening? Well, jurists are going to say, well, there's no punishment for blasphemy, but if someone is blasphemous against the Prophet, then that act itself removes them from Islam. And that removal from Islam then triggers the punishment, but for apostasy. Right? That's how they approach it. They're not saying that blasphemy itself is a crime, but the consequence of blasphemy leads to a certain set of affairs that then warrants punishment. They differentiate between blasphemy and apostasy. Right? Why is this important? Why is Ghamidi Saab taking time to explain this? Because we are moving between these very delicate areas of where your opinion or something you express that gets interpreted in a particular way can trigger a series of things that link you to other more significant sins that then carry particular punishment. Within Maududi's ideas, Maulana Maududi's ideas, Ghamidi Saab points out that he introduces something new, a new shade in the traditional narrative. And what he does is, he does something which he consistently ends up doing that makes him distinct, in my view, from the others, from the three other crafters, if you will, of the traditional narrative. The three other folks exist, and scholars in the sort of pre-modern period, in the period before colonialism, in the period when Muslims held political power, feel no need to offer an explanation for their positions. The key difference with Maulana Maududi is that he is taking the traditional narrative and he is providing a rationale for it, an explanation for it. The scholars prior to him do not care. It's not their concern. In fact, it doesn't even come within their purview. They don't feel any sense that they need to explain themselves to anybody. It's an absurdity for them. But Maulana Maududi exists at a time where that Muslim power has gone, where there's colonial rule over Muslim land, where all around Islamic civilization is having an existential moment. And so Maulana Maududi begins to explain things within his context, explain things from the traditional narrative. And here he does something interesting with apostasy that ends up having consequences subsequently. What he does is, he says, and we're going to get into a discussion of the state a little bit more, but what Ghamidi Sahib points out is that what Maulana Maududi does in the context of apostasy is say this: religion is the state. Religion and the state are the same. Right? This is a profound point, because by making this association, by essentially saying that if you want me to say, Maududi Sahib is saying that if you want me to say what Islam is, then I'm going to, if you want me to say what Islam is, then I'm going to say that it is the state. And by doing that, what does that mean? That means when you do something against the state, we consider it to be treason. When you betray the state, it is treason. When you reject the state, it is treason. So, he says, if you do something against Islam, then it is as though you have committed treason. That, Ghamidi Sahib says, that move, that association has profound consequences. Now, apostasy for Maududi Sahib is justified just like the punishment for treason is justified in any other state. Now, a follow-up might be, well, that doesn't seem like the same thing. After all, treason means you're doing some kind of harm to the state. That's why it's not like, oh, you decided to move to another state. That's not considered treason. So why would leaving Islam be considered treason? And for this, Maududi Sahib, Maulana Maududi, answer to that is simply this: no, actually, by leaving Islam, you actually threaten the potential for that act to multiply, for that act to then cause others to leave Islam, and that then causes significant harm. And that then is treasonous. All right. So, Ghamidi Sahib explains Maududi's view here and essentially points out, yes, all of them will say that punishment is death for apostasy, but Maududi is the only one that actually explains it by making this association between or connecting religion and the state as one and the same. Another issue that comes up in apostasy that the traditional narrative has to tackle, that Ghamidi Sahib explained, is that in the case of the Ahmadiyya, what should happen now that there are two generations of Ahmadiyya? Are they all apostate? Does everyone face the death penalty? And here, scholars struggled, because classically, that's what it should have been. But they realize that that is going to be a problematic position. And so instead, Ghamidi Sahib explains that what ends up happening is they rely upon the opinion of Muhammad Iqbal, which essentially, in his view, they call it his ijtihad, says no, you can give the apostates a type of minority status, a position of essentially subjugation, and that can suffice as a replacement from the carrying out of the death penalty. And here, within the classical jurisprudence, there are a number of potential critiques that one can raise as to how that simply doesn't seem like it would be possible. Nor does it seem like Iqbal would be considered, classically speaking, to be in a position to have that type of ijtihad. But what the scholars rely on is the weight of Iqbal's personality to allow them to adopt that opinion without much grief. But why is that opinion important? What is Ghamidi Sahib setting up for us? In part, what he's beginning to explain is the role that the notion of subjugation begins to play within the mindset and narrative that's getting created. Subordinate status becomes something that is essential within this traditional narrative that is now trying to find its place in this new modern world that no longer has political power. Okay. Now, where do we go next? Next, within the first point, essential point of the traditional narrative, we said there was apostasy, shirk, and kufr. So now we go to shirk and kufr. And here then this idea of subjugation comes up. Because the classical fiqh basically says, and is agreement on, that shirk and kufr should not gain domination. They should not become dominant. There's an understanding, Ghamidi Sahib notes, that shirk and kufr are going to exist. Right? There might be a goal to eradicate, but essentially that is going to be difficult to occur. So the goal is that they should not dominate. There should be no domination. Right? In the case of apostasy, there again, you're trying to eradicate, and there's an individual, and they're committing apostasy, and so eradication in the sense of a punishment of death, okay, you can do that from a classical standpoint. That is something that can be accomplished. But there's a sense that in the context of kufr, in these broader ideas of kufr, this broader idea of shirk, that is going to be hard to do. So the other approach becomes subjugation. You subjugate the thing, the sin, to such a degree that is essentially lifeless. It is essentially as though it doesn't exist. Eradicating it completely is difficult. Classical fiqh recognizes this. The traditional religious narrative recognizes this. But you have to finish shirk and kufr. That is a goal. So the question then is, okay, You want to subjugate, you want to eradicate, etc. The question becomes, how do you do it? How is that done? And here then, you end up having the introduction of the ideas around warfare. And there, Maududi Sahib, Maulana Maududi puts forward these two ideas around warfare. One, he says, is there's a defensive type of war. As Ghamidi Sahib notes, Ghamidi Sahib puts forward, says that these are the two ideas that Maududi has on warfare. One is defensive. There's no need for a detailed explanation as to why defensive warfare is okay. Everyone understands that. Everyone gets that. They accept that this is permissible. You have the right to do it. You have the right to defend yourself. All right. Well, what's the other one? Well, the other one is a reformative war. What does that mean? That means it is a war that looks to eradicate, to push out, to cleanse bid'ah, corruption, corrupt practices from existing in the world. And what are these corrupt practices? First and foremost, kufr and shirk. And for Ghamidi, this is what is put forward by the traditional narrative as the purpose of faith. To put things, to make sure that you are commanding right and forbidding wrong. Right? Okay. But then the question becomes, what do you do? Do you fight everywhere? And there again, you run into a similar problem as regards to instituting the death penalty on everyone? No. There again, as Maududi notes, need to make sure that these things, shirk and kufr, do not gain power. No one in the world has a right to rule if they follow shirk and kufr. That's the traditional narrative view. And Maududi puts it forward as well. You have a right to exist, but you do not have a right to power. And they point to the Quran, speaking of jizya and giving of jizya in exchange for this position of subjugation. Islam is the universal state. Islam needs to be the dominant power. That's where the traditional narrative sets itself up. Kufr, shirk, apostasy need to be eradicated, but you have to have power to do that. And Maududi takes this one step further. He takes it one step further. He says it's not simply enough that a nation ascribe to Islam. So we talking about nations should not have power that do shirk, do kufr. But even nations that don't do that, that actually ascribe to Islam, if they do not follow the divine law, then that itself is a type of evil, and they should also be erased, eradicated. They should be subjugated. That state of affairs cannot be accepted. He goes to the point, as Ghamidi Sahib notes, to say that that is a type of evil, such that during colonial rule in India, a railroad worker was simply by working his job was committing evil and needed to stop. Okay, so in conclusion, for all these reasons, the idea is that a state anywhere in the world that has shirk, has kufr, the traditional narrative, as Ghamidi Sahib explains, says that they must be subjugated. That's 100% certain. That has to happen. It can't be a state of affairs where they would have some dominance over Islam. When that happens, how that happens, different discussion. But the fact that that needs to happen for the traditional narrative, there's no doubt about that. The debate is only around the strategy for making it happen and who has the authority to do so. That is what Ghamidi Saab says is where the energy is. But the issue, in his view, of whether they should be subjugated is without debate within the traditional narrative. All right, so that's where we're left. We've talked about this first point, this idea of erasing shirk, kufr, and apostasy as part of one of the programs, the most essential programs of the traditional narrative. And what Ghamidi is setting up for us, what Ghamidi Saab is setting up for us, are all of these things have consequences in the construction of the mindset that now influences the worldview of many folks that are engaged in certain types of behavior and others who are not, but who may still be influenced by that. And for him, that is why there is the need to present a counter-narrative to try to address these factors and address this mindset that, as he will later show, actually is problematic, in his view, from the standpoint of Islam itself. I look forward to continuing this journey with you. Wa akhir ad-da'wa walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.